Tonight we're witnessing a geopolitical paradox that NATO strategists had never anticipated, that Kremlin officials are exploiting with calculated silence, and that European defense ministers are now describing as the most dangerous fracture in transatlantic relations since the Suez Crisis of 1956, a situation that escalated not through months of diplomatic deterioration, but through a concentrated 72-hour period where presidential rhetoric transformed from controversial statements into explicit military threats that forced America's oldest European ally to publicly declare that continued aggression would terminate the NATO alliance entirely. 72 hours that revealed fundamental contradictions in American Arctic strategy. 72 hours that exposed the strategic gift Trump's territorial ambitions represent for Russian President Vladimir Putin. 72 hours that demonstrated how quickly alliance cohesion can collapse when the world's most powerful nation threatens military action against a partner democracy. What unfolded between January 4th and January 7th represents something unprecedented in post-war Western relations. The spectacle of a sitting American president openly discussing military options to seize territory from a NATO member state, while Russian leadership watches in what multiple intelligence analysts are characterizing as barely concealed satisfaction. The sequence of statements reveals a pattern that foreign policy experts find deeply concerning because it suggests decisions are being made without consideration of strategic consequences or alliance implications. On January 4th, President Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One that Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships and that the United States needs the island for national security purposes, framing territorial acquisition as an urgent defensive necessity. 48 hours later, the White House released an official statement confirming that Trump and his team are discussing a range of options to pursue Greenland acquisition and that utilizing the U.S. military remains an option at the commander-in-chief's disposal. That escalation from rhetorical interest to explicit military threat occurred without any apparent diplomatic engagement with Danish officials, without consultation with NATO leadership, and without consideration for how such statements would be interpreted by adversaries who have spent years trying to fracture Western alliance structures. According to multiple European security analysts speaking on background, the speed of this escalation suggests decisions are being driven by impulse rather than strategic planning, which makes the situation particularly dangerous because there are no clear off-ramps or de-escalation mechanisms in place. What makes Russia's response so strategically significant is not what Moscow is saying, but what Moscow is conspicuously not saying. The Kremlin has been notably silent on Trump's Greenland takeover ambitions, despite having far more reason than China to be vocal about potential U.S. actions in the Arctic. Russia spans 53% of the Arctic Ocean coastline, maintains critical military infrastructure throughout the region, including its sea-based nuclear deterrent, and has explicitly identified Arctic control as a strategic priority for economic and security reasons. Yet when presented with an American president threatening to use military force to seize an Arctic territory from a NATO ally, Russian official responses have been minimal and carefully measured. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stated only that Moscow is closely watching Trump's statements, offering no condemnation of American territorial ambitions and no expression of concern about NATO expansion in the Arctic. That silence is deliberate and strategic because Russian leadership understands that Trump's Greenland rhetoric accomplishes Putin's primary geopolitical objective without requiring any Russian action whatsoever. Former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General Jamie Shea explained the dynamic clearly when he noted that the obvious alarm among European leaders and the growing possibility of NATO's dissolution are an absolute gift to Putin. For years, Russian strategic planning has focused on weakening NATO cohesion, creating divisions between the United States and European allies, and undermining confidence in American security guarantees. Trump's threats against Greenland achieve all three objectives simultaneously while allowing Russia to maintain the appearance of restrained neutrality. European leaders have reacted with a combination of shock and strategic clarity that reflects the seriousness with which they view the current situation. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stated categorically that the United States has no right to annex any part of the Danish kingdom and that any military action to seize Greenland would spell the end of the NATO alliance. That is not diplomatic hyperbole designed to discourage American action through rhetorical escalation. That is a factual assessment of what NATO's legal framework requires in the event that one member state attacks another. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty obligates all alliance members to treat an attack on one member as an attack on all members, which means that American military action against Greenland would theoretically require European NATO members to respond militarily against the United States. The logical impossibility of that scenario is precisely why Frederiksen's statement is accurate. NATO cannot survive if its most powerful member attacks one of its smallest members, regardless of how that attack is legally characterized or strategically justified. European Commission officials have echoed that assessment, stating explicitly that it is for Denmark and Greenland, and them only, to decide on matters concerning Denmark and Greenland. French President Emmanuel Macron reinforced European solidarity by hosting Danish leadership at the Élysée Palace specifically to demonstrate unified opposition to American territorial ambitions. These responses indicate that European governments are treating Trump's statements as genuine threats rather than negotiating tactics, which represents a fundamental breakdown in how alliance members perceive American intentions and reliability. The strategic absurdity of Trump's Greenland position becomes apparent when examining what the United States already possesses in terms of Arctic access and security infrastructure. The United States operates Patuxent Space Base in North northwestern Greenland under a 1951 defense treaty with Denmark that provides extensive operational latitude for American military activities. The base supports missile warning systems, missile defense operations, and space surveillance critical to protecting North American airspace from potential Russian ballistic missile attacks. Greenland's position also allows NATO to monitor the GI-UK gap, the strategic choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, where Russian naval movements in the North Atlantic can be tracked and potentially interdicted. Denmark has repeatedly confirmed willingness to expand American military presence in Greenland, accommodate additional personnel and infrastructure, and cooperate on any security measures Washington deems necessary for Arctic defense. In other words, the United States already has functional control over everything Trump claims to want from Greenland without requiring territorial acquisition, without alienating a critical ally, and without handing Putin a strategic victory by fracturing NATO from within. What Trump is demanding goes beyond security requirements into the realm of territorial expansion that resembles 19th century imperialism rather than 21st century alliance management. The comparison to historical land acquisitions is not accidental because Trump's approach to Greenland follows the same pattern as his statements about the Panama Canal, Canada, and Venezuela, framing territorial control as a national security imperative regardless of existing treaties, international law, or allied relationships. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been carefully calibrating his public statements to maximize the strategic benefits of Trump's rhetoric while avoiding any appearance of encouraging American actions that might unite European opposition. Speaking at an Arctic forum in Murmansk in March 2025, Putin described U.S. plans regarding Greenland as serious rather than extravagant, acknowledging heightened geopolitical competition in the Arctic while asserting that the issue has nothing to do with Russia beyond broader regional concerns. That carefully neutral framing allows Putin to position Russia as a reasonable actor respecting sovereignty while the United States openly discusses military seizure of Allied territory. Putin has also stated that Russia will closely follow developments and mount appropriate responses by increasing military capability and modernizing military infrastructure in the Arctic, framing Russian militarization as a defensive response to American aggression rather than offensive expansion. The strategic messaging is clear. Russia presents itself as the defender of international norms, while America becomes the revisionist power threatening established borders and alliance structures. Nancy Pelosi made this dynamic explicit when she characterized Trump's Greenland focus as flirting with disruption of NATO in a manner that benefits Putin, suggesting that whether intentional or not, Trump's territorial ambitions serve Russian strategic interests by weakening Western alliance cohesion. The historical parallel that should concern anyone analyzing this situation is how quickly alliance structures can collapse once member states begin questioning the reliability and intentions of their most powerful partner. NATO has survived for 75 years because European nations trusted that American security commitments were credible, that American leadership would prioritize alliance stability over unilateral actions, and that disagreements would be resolved through diplomatic consultation rather than military threats. Trump's statements about Greenland have shattered all three assumptions simultaneously, forcing European governments to publicly consider scenarios where the United States might use military force against a NATO ally, where American territorial ambitions might override treaty obligations, and where alliance membership might provide no protection against American coercion. Those are precisely the questions Putin wants European leaders asking because they undermine the entire foundation of transatlantic security cooperation. Tonight, as this situation continues developing without clear diplomatic resolution, the silence from Moscow remains the most telling indicator of who benefits strategically from Trump's Greenland rhetoric, and that silence should terrify anyone concerned about maintaining the Western alliance structures that have preserved European security for 3/4 of a century.